We are now on the cusp of a brand new period of European history, and that is known as the Enlightenment. What's kind of exciting about this period is that it really directly relates to the modern age in quite an amazing way. You're going to see why very soon. And it is also the first time that I can say very definitively that a cultural movement starts in England. Up till now, the story of Europe has basically been dominated by Greece and Rome, with some influence in Paris and in Spain. And for the first time, England truly takes the crown and runs with it and develops a whole new way of thinking about the world. Now, the other really neat thing about this period is that it is considered to be modern, which that word in and of itself obviously suggests the now, the moment, what we're living in currently. And that is why when we go through this material, a lot of it is going to seem kind of obvious to you. It's going to be like, well, of course that's what we think. Of course that's what we believe, and so forth. Well, that is because this is a period that really closely aligns with what we believe now. But you can't kind of underestimate how important these guys were in their own time, because they were inventing the ideas that we now take for granted. And so basically, as we're going through this, the philosophy and the way they thought about science is going to make a lot of sense to you. It's going to be very logical and very appropriate because it's still largely what we think as well. Now we're also going to see the continuation of the church's power. We already saw that in the Baroque period. We know that the church was a little bit on the decline. And again, I just want to remind you, decline does not equal dead. I am in no way suggesting that the church did not matter anymore, because it is still very important. But we have other institutions kind of rising up in competition or in contrast to the church to try to basically take over. And then lastly, we're going to see something fascinating here. The Baroque period, which is the period that we just took a look at, was really focused on emotion and expression and power and sexuality. And it was extremely influential because now that we're in the Enlightenment, people start to rebel against that. They look at the Baroque period as too excessive, as too emotional, as too wild, as too passionate. And instead, what we see is a revival of classicism. People want to go back to kind of those ideals of beauty that we would have seen in ancient Greece and Rome. And I put on the screen here an image of a very traditional temple, showing harmony, symmetry, proportion, and balance. Now, obviously, we're not really living in temples or creating temples anymore, but that the idea is there that that is the kind of art we want. We want art that's rational, that's logical, that's symmetrical, and so forth, not wildly passionate. Now, the big buzzword and what we're really going to focus on over the coming weeks as we continue to explore the Enlightenment in a great detail is all going to be philosophy. This is the era where people start thinking about the way life should be in a much more rational, pragmatic way. And essentially, if you think about the scientific revolution, which came right at the tail end of the Baroque period, they start taking all those scientific thoughts of proof and of hypothesis and of testing and so forth, and they start applying it to kind of the big questions of life. Like, what is man really about? Are we inherently good or are we inherently evil? What form of government should we have? And obviously you can see that that's very closely related to what the true nature of man is. And also, for the first time truly in human history, comes up the idea of basic human rights. That there are things that just by virtue of us being alive, we're entitled to. And obviously their list of basic human rights was a lot shorter than the list that we would actually draw today. But the whole point is, again, it's a start. And just someone standing up and saying that just because you're not an aristocrat, just because you're like an ordinary person running around in Europe and working your butt off just to try to survive, that you still deserve certain things just like any king or aristocrat would, was truly, truly astounding. As I said, again, this is going to look very familiar as we go forward. One interesting difference, I would say, though, is the view they had of the future. I always joke that these people were just walking around like they were at Disney all the time, and they were singing "It's a Great Big Beautiful Tomorrow." They just truly believed it, that literally man is perfectible, that we can create societies and we can shape our world any way we want to. And if we can do that, then let's make it awesome and let's make it incredible for all of our sakes. Now, as I mentioned, the Enlightenment truly does begin in England. And what's interesting is that, again, it is purely a reaction to what we have seen going on over the last few hundred years. They looked at all the Baroque, they looked at all the paintings of Caravaggio, the sculptures of Bernini, and they were like, this is a little bit much, in our opinion. This is way too sexual. This is way too expressive. We need to really kind of tone it down. The other thing that's interesting about England is that they had also gone through a series of very bloody civil wars. Literally, a king is going to be executed by the people that for the first time in English history. We're going to see all kinds of devastation and, of course, everything that comes with warfare. And plus, to even make things worse, it's a civil war. So it's Englishmen fighting Englishmen, which in some ways is even more painful and difficult to overcome than a war against an outside enemy. This is also the beginning of a really strong animosity between England and Ireland. You might be familiar with that even to this day, that for quite a long time there has been this strong dislike between the two countries. That stems from this civil war where literally the English go into Ireland and execute on average of between 35 to 50% of the Irish population, man, women, and child. Nobody was spared. And obviously that is going to leave a legacy of hate. But the Irish lined up against the king, and basically the king, went after them. Now, we have all these like political backgrounds and backdrops happening. We also have something very, very physical that takes place in London. And it takes place on September 2nd, 1666. And the of course, predominantly Christian community looked at this year and just from the very beginning of it, just knew that something evil was going to happen, with a number like 666 facing you. And they basically were able to basically see that evil thing happen in September, which was known as the Great Fire of London. Now, obviously, when you think about, what London would have been like in this period, obviously, they didn't have any sort of building code, so, any sort of haphazard, structures could be thrown up overnight with no city governance. Obviously, the majority of houses in this period were built of wood because that was the cheapest, most available material. And there was no sort of idea or sense that, you need to be a certain distance away from your neighbor, things like that for sanitation and other purposes. So what ends up happening, frankly, is that a fire starts in one area and it very quickly just like runs wild and it jumps from building to building and house to house and it spreads and encompasses almost the entire city of London. Okay. And think about the scale of that. Think about like our modern New York City, like and just how magnificently huge it is compared to the average city in America, right? Well, now imagine about 3/4 of New York City going up in flames overnight, because that is exactly what happened to London. It was absolutely looked upon as just like this huge, horrible disaster. And you can see actually when you look at this screen, like the black line around there was like the city limits of London. The pinkish area, salmon color there, that is what was destroyed. Okay, so not only was a large majority of the city within the city gates, burned to the ground, but also a fair bit of it outside as well, where kind of the sprawl had begun to set in. Now, this destruction, this absolute destruction, was obviously devastating, especially to the poor, because their houses were suddenly wiped out. But, and this is a big but, it became basically symbolic in a way of what was happening in England at the time. That we basically have this opportunity to have a blank slate over one of the most important cities in Europe. This is an awesome opportunity to take all this new scientific learning we have and actually apply it. How about we actually plan the city streets so that, it's easier to traverse from one end of the city to the other? How about we actually try to allow for increased sanitation, so that people aren't going to get so sick from being on top of each other all the time, and we can actually get rid of public waste in a much more efficient way and so forth. And so the city actually sets all these really brilliant ideals for what they're going to actually try to do. And in some ways it's successful, in other ways it's not, just because the problem is people need places to live now. So even though the city tried to kind of regulate and control how Reconstruction took place, obviously at a certain level it's just going to be, we need to get houses, we need to get places for all these people to go, and so it's not ideal. The person who is basically tasked with this overwhelming job of recreating London was a gentleman by the name of Christopher Wren, and there he is in his awesome little hat. I wish we still wore those today. Excuse me, wigs. But nonetheless, he basically is told by the monarch in England, there you go. We want London to be modern. Go. And he came up with absolutely brilliant designs that, if he had an extra 10 years to actually sit down and make it happen, London would be a very different place. But like I said, a lot of, what we, needed to do had to be expedited just because of the, the need for housing that the poor people had. But one major thing that he insisted upon and actually did get carried out was that wood was banned from construction. That was why London was so susceptible to fire, because wood obviously burns much more easily than marble or stone or brick. And so therefore, London insisted that any new construction be made of these more durable materials. And obviously that's why we build the way we do now, because as inheritors of the English culture, we adopted that same idea. And that is why, of course, our structures today are a lot more protected from fire, even though still obviously we can still, be susceptible as well. Now, the most famous structure he created was known as St. Paul's Cathedral. He actually, when he redesigned London, he did it with cathedrals on like every corner. And his original plans called for just dozens and dozens of new churches to accommodate all the population. Now, again, not going to happen just from a speed standpoint, but one of the most famous ones that does get built is St. Paul's, and it is basically kind of the heart of London nowadays. Here's an image of St. Paul's. I apologize, it's a little fuzzy, but I wanted you to see a head-on view of it, because when you look at it, you see kind of in physical shape here that rationalism I'm talking about. We have that domed structure that's so traditional from like ancient Roman temples. Greek did not tend to have a lot of domes. We see the lovely symmetry that there's two bell towers on either side. We see all the little columns everywhere, exactly like a temple, and we have that lovely triangular pediment on top there right in the center, just like a temple would have. They are literally looking back at the ancients, and actually looking back at the Renaissance, which of course had adopted a lot of the rationalism from the ancients as well. And they are trying to draw a direct line between our stability and strength and intelligence and the wonderful ancient cultures that they are depending upon. Now, I have to point out one thing that drives me absolutely crazy, and I'm sorry if I'm going to bother you by pointing it out, but as you can see on the right, there's a beautiful clock there, and on the left, there's a big hole. Wren drives me nuts that he didn't bother to put a clock in that other tower. But for whatever reason, that's kind of the one breach of symmetry in an otherwise very perfectly symmetrical structure. Now, at the same time that London was reinventing itself, different philosophers started taking deeper looks at what kind of government should we have. And basically, it all boiled down to two primary philosophers who to this day basically dominate the argument about what man is truly like and what kind of government we deserve. Now, the older gentleman, the one who put out his ideals first, was a man named Thomas Hobbes. And he had actually lived through those English Civil Wars I was just talking about. He saw firsthand kind of the inhumanity we were capable of, and how easily, we went in and butchered the Irish and started murdering our fellow countrymen and so forth. And because of that, it's not really too shocking. He decided that human nature is inherently negative, that basically we're pretty awful people, and we will do anything to each other if it means that we get something good out of it. One of his really famous quotes about people is that our lives are nasty, brutish, and short. And essentially, if that's the case, if we are that kind of people, and if we are primarily driven by fear of death and desire for power, then we need somebody in charge who's really powerful who can control us. Thomas Hobbes basically was a proponent of absolutism, which is just a fancy-dancy term for a strong central leader, almost like a dictator or like an emperor, somebody really powerful who can pass really tough laws that's going to keep us in check. Because guess what? If we have an opportunity to, steal or cheat or lie or, do something, we don't care if we hurt another person, if at the end of the day it's going to benefit us. That was his argument. And the famous work he published was a book called Leviathan. And the Leviathan, again, kind of a crazy term. All it is like it's a massive sea animal. Like it's like a monster, like, something that dwells in the ocean. And he viewed the government as the Leviathan. He called it the Leviathan of state, that literally the state should be so powerful and be able to pass such stringent laws and kind of keep us in check that we can't help but get along and we can't help but function. His idea was that if we do not do that, if we do not have that powerful central structure, that ultimately everyone is going to suffer. And so it is worth giving up a little bit of our freedom, or in Hobbes' case, a lot of our freedom, in exchange for peace and stability. Now, the gentleman on the other side was a man by the name of John Locke. Now, he was a little bit younger than Hobbes. He did not see the ravages of the English Civil War firsthand, and therefore he actually grew up kind of a little bit more positive and a little bit perhaps more naive about human nature. He said, look, I know we can do bad things to each other sometimes, but come on, let's face it. Fundamentally, you can trust most people. You can, assume that most people are going to do the right thing if they're given the chance. And if we believe that, people are fundamentally good, there really is no need for this Leviathan of state to kind of squeeze us and keep us in check. Really give us the chance. We will do the right thing. And there is absolutely no reason that we should give up our natural freedom. I mean, we're born naturally free. We should totally be able to live in a free state, given, very minimal restrictions on our freedoms, and everything will be good. And in fact, Locke went totally the opposite way. As far as looking at, our ruler, Hobbes wanted that really strong, authoritating guy who's going to basically hammer us down if we step out of line. Locke went the other way, and he said we should actually have power limits on the ruler. We need to make sure that our rulers can't become, massive dictators and so forth, because that is the innate nature of ruling, is that people try to expand their power. So let's have those systems of checks and balances. Let's make sure they can't, become too overwhelming. And his idea is basically what we would now call liberalism. Okay, just the idea that we should have a say in who governs us. We should have a say in how we're governed, and fundamentally kind of that almost American concept of what our government should look like. Now, essentially what both of these gentlemen are fighting about, the philosophical term for it, is a social contract. Okay, and contract, by definition, if you think about it, when you sign a contract to buy a car, you are promising that you're going to pay money, and the person you're buying the car from is promising that they're going to give you a car. It's an exchange, right? Well, both of these gentlemen and social philosophers in general argue that is exactly what's happening in a government, okay? That the individuals, the people themselves that live in a certain society, are basically signing a contract to pay in terms of freedom. We're giving up some of our freedom to the government. And in exchange, the government is going to give us certain things back. They're going to protect us. They're going to keep the peace. They're going to defend our rights and so forth. So that's basically the only way society can function according to these social philosophers, that both, there's an exchange happening, and by nature, we have to give up some of our freedoms. Right? Because if we lived totally independently, we were just running naked through the woods and had nothing to do with each other, we would have unlimited freedom, right? We could do anything we wanted, anytime we wanted, anywhere we wanted. By virtue of living in society, though, that's no longer the case. I am not allowed to run around like hitting people and taking whatever I want and so forth, because by virtue of living in the state of Florida, I have agreed to abide by its laws. And that is the price of freedom, which is somewhat ironic. Now, the fundamental difference then between Locke and Hobbes is how much freedom should we give up? Hobbes would argue we have to give up a lot of freedom because basically freedom is just a bad excuse for us to take advantage of other people. Locke, on the other hand, would argue no, no, no. We do not have to give up a lot of freedom because we are fundamentally good. And when given the choice, when given the freedom to act the way we know we want to, that we would do the right thing. And of course, the question ever since both of these gentlemen laid out their ideas, who's right?